one of the experiments, you might say, that I'm doing in this ecclesiology course is having us read a chapter of Romans for each week. And it's almost a perfect lineup. There's only 15 weeks of actual course content rather than 16. There's 16 chapters, but we get pretty close. And so I've provided an adapted translation of Romans for us in the course. And I got this idea from a former professor of mine, Ted Jennings. I took a class from him. He's a theologian on the book of Romans. And it was the best course I've ever had. And I've taken 2 other courses on Romans from actual biblical scholars. But his course changed my life. And one of the things he had us do was read this adapted translation of Romans. And why did he do that, and why am I doing that? Well, because sometimes we don't hear the Word of God when we read the Bible, because we already know what it's going to say before we even open the pages. It's so familiar to us that we've lost the ability for it to speak. So I provided this adapted translation that I've systematically, consistently altered some of the way that words are translated, particular words, in a way that I think remains faithful, I hope remains faithful, I pray remains faithful to the original text, but helps us to hear that text afresh. So for some examples, I've taken the word Christ, which we think of as Jesus' last name, even when we know it's not his last name. It's a title, and it's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Messiah. So I've changed it to Messiah in our translation. So we'll be reading about Jesus Messiah, Messiah Jesus. And that just that subtle difference might cause us to have to pull back from the text a little bit. And that space that's created allows the text to speak again, to offer a new word for us today. Now, we'll see how it plays out, right? It's an experiment. I've taken the word faith, the Greek pistis, and changed it to faithful. And if you read the TDNT article on the Greek pistis, you find out that faithful is actually a fairly strong contender for the way we maybe should be translating that word. Loyal. Right? This is the faithfulness of a relationship. I'm faithful to my spouse. That kind of implication. And so it goes from, we keep thinking that faith is about believing certain things. What if it's about a certain form of loyalty to the Messiah? I've taken the word Jews and changed it to Judeans, the word spiritual, and changed it to spirited. These were all terms that Ted Jennings had changed in my class, and so I've been consistent with that, and we'll see what you think as you go. So we're going to be reading this a chapter at a time each week, but I've also, in our adapted translation, removed all of the chapter and verse divisions. The original Greek didn't even have punctuation. It was all uppercase, no spacing, really hard to read. So I kept the spacing and punctuation, but I also removed, I think most of or all the capitalizations. Paul didn't write the original text in chapters and verses. They were added later. And when they were added, they actually broke up the flow of his thought. Romans, as the way that Ted presented it to us and the way I'm presenting it to you, is one long, coherent, and cohesive argument. And that argument climaxes in chapters, what we call chapters 9 through 11. The chapters that most, especially Arminian evangelicals, don't read at all because they don't make any sense to us. We can't make sense of God's election when we're Wesleyan or something like that. But this argument is climaxing in this argument about God's faithfulness to God's elect people. And so what Paul's saying in chapters 2 and 4 and 5 and all those other chapters up before 9, he's setting that, or he's building that argument. He's constructing that argument. And what he says in chapters 12 and 14 and all those chapters after 11 are some of the implications that there might be from that argument. The way the Bible is most often betrayed today is by fragmenting it. So we're going to try to address that to some extent. Not perfectly, but make some steps in that regard. But why Romans? This is a class on ecclesiology. You know, when I was a kid, we were given these tracts called the Romans Road to Salvation. This was ways to get people to lead people to Jesus, right? And the church had no part in the Romans Road to Salvation. There was no church in the Romans Road to Salvation. Our little evangelical tracts that we were taught. So why Romans? Back in the early 1900s, Karl Barth, he tried to read Romans as if it were addressed to the crisis of Western civilization of his time. And so I'm approaching our study of the church as if the church, too, were God's plan to address the crisis of human civilization in our time. And maybe our reading of Romans can help with that. For Barth, Romans was the Word of God that brings... the Word of God is what brings Western civilization into a theological crisis. And this was the view of the pastor of a small, economically depressed congregation in a little insignificant town in Switzerland. Many of the men in his village, in his church, were out of work and economically exploited. Very few of them actually came to church. From that situation, the pastor of this insignificant town, where most of the men didn't attend his church, from that situation, Barth felt compelled, almost prophetically called, to bring the Word of God to that town, and from that town to the world. Barth is the person I would consider to be the most important theological voice of the 20th century. Maybe I would put him arguably in the top 3 theologians of all time: Augustine, Aquinas, and Karl Barth. The Great War had killed most of the men in Europe, and for nothing at all. It was a senseless, rationless, without reason, right? Whatever that word is, needless, pointless war, as like almost all wars are. And worse, Karl Barth's teachers, the great intellectual, theological voices of Europe, the great spiritual leaders of his day, they had signed a declaration supporting the Kaiser's war efforts. He felt betrayed. He was betrayed. Barth's theological models had collapsed. He was disillusioned and confused, but he had a responsibility to his town as their pastor. And so Barth is wrestling with Paul's ideas in that context. If this Christianity thing is legit, then it has to mean something here, in this crisis. This is why we're also reading Kavanaugh's book, Torture and Eucharist. But how about us? What crisis are we facing? What could it mean if Paul were writing to our crisis? If the church is legit, then it has to be able to address us today in the mess that we call society. So we're studying ecclesiology, but we're doing it in a particular context and for a particular purpose. Ours is not a generic academic study of the church. I'm not interested in that. I don't see the point. That's not how theology developed originally. And I don't think it's helpful to imagine theology should go in that direction. How does God's church today reach into the crisis of American and global civilization? That is the question that drives our study of the church.